Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It's Thursday, July 17th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob. How you doing?
Hey, Jessica. Good to be with you again.
Good to be with you each week. It is day 650 of the war. Syria said late Wednesday that it began withdrawing its army from the Druze majority city of Suwayda after agreeing to a new ceasefire. We'll obviously go through the latest on that front. Back home in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox Shas party said that its ministers would resign from the government due to the dispute over ultra-Orthodox enlistment, and we'll talk about that as well. On the Gaza front, a hostage deal seems more likely than not, and we'll hear what Jacob has to say about that. And we'll also, if we have some time, we'll discuss the latest with GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and aid situation. So stay with us. Okay, Jacob, let's start with Syria. So a new ceasefire on the table. That's after more than 300 people are reported to have been killed, according to a war monitor. Israel got involved in this with IDF troops defending the Druze in Syria, and there were Druze citizens of Israel who crossed over the border into Syria to join the fight and then were brought back home to Israel. And then we also heard statements from U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio about a real, quote, de-escalation. How did this situation actually get started, this conflict?
Sure. So I think we can go about back to around Friday when these clashes started erupting between two ethnic minority groups in southwest Syria, the Druze, who obviously are the main players in this, and also Bedouin and their clans that have been in a long-standing conflict with Druze in the southwest of Syria, but things got extra heated around Friday. There was allegations of kidnapping from one or the other, and even killings that took place. And the situation heated up through the weekend. And on Tuesday, basically, there was a decision by the Syrian government to try to bring its forces into the area of Sweda, which is this majority Druze city in southwest Syria, in order to try to calm tensions. But what ended up happening is that we saw some of these troops or Syrian government-linked militia groups actually taking part in some of these attacks on the Druze minority in Syria. And we even saw these very disturbing clips that went viral of members of these Syrian militia groups that were shaving the mustaches off of Druze sheikhs in this area. And Druze, their religious leaders tend to not shave their mustaches. So this is seen as something that was trying to intentionally embarrass them. And even one of the sheikhs that had their mustache shaved actually was found dead later in the day. So there was a lot of anger amongst Druze both in Israel, but also, of course, in Syria. And by Wednesday afternoon, we had, as you mentioned, I think there were 250 reportedly killed. By Wednesday evening, Thursday morning, it was up to 350. So you started to see, as I mentioned, this anger on the Israeli side of the border. Israeli Jews actually started gradually crossing the border. The IDF, I think, initially tried to stop this because if there's an incident where an Israeli citizen is killed on enemy lines, that ends up being a major diplomatic incident that they don't want to have to deal with. But eventually, I think there was a decision to allow those who were insisting on crossing the border to do so. And I think we had at one point up to 1,000 Israeli Druze on the Syrian side of the border. As IDF was instructed not to use violence to try to bring them back. You had this also interesting dynamic where some people were going to the other side in order to try to retrieve Israeli Druze who had crossed the border. Those included Hamad Amar, the Druze MK from Israel Beitenu, Avigdor Lieberman's right-wing party. He claimed that was why he went over. So a very chaotic dynamic happening. And around when all this was happening, we also saw Syria government dispatch tanks to the area of Sweda. And this was seen as a red line by the Israeli government, who has been adamant about this being a demilitarized zone. And you started seeing Israeli strikes on these Syrian tanks. not necessarily to kill those who were in them, though there were members of the Syrian army that were killed reportedly, but more to send a message that this is not something that Israel will allow. And in addition to that, we saw something even more far reaching, which was these strikes in Damascus itself that were targeting these government sites, including right by the Syrian presidential palace, and then the entire military headquarters in Damascus, which was blown up on air. A couple broadcasts were able to catch that live, really shocking the broadcasters who were in the middle of taping. But when this started happening, I think we saw a shift, maybe not a shift because the U.S. was pretty nervous about this from the get-go, but the pressure from the U.S. to wrap this up started to escalate. You had, I believe, there was several calls that took place between the U.S. envoy to Syria, Tom Barak, and the Israeli Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer, where basically the message was, take a breath. Let's stop these airstrikes. It's one thing to be striking down in southern Syria, but to go all the way to Damascus, you're risking actually collapsing the regime. That's not something that the U.S. is okay with. We want to be able to maybe advance the Abraham Accords, and Syria just a few days ago is supposed to be a candidate, and you're harming our chances to do that. I guess as a result of U.S. pressure, by the evening, we saw the Syrian government, which I think was also eager to announce a ceasefire, did just that. And we saw a gradual withdrawal of troops, as you mentioned, towards on Wednesday evening, where it seems like we're getting to a place where there's calm.
So now that we're possibly seeing a calm coming over or getting to some kind of calm in this situation, how do you think each side really views this situation that blew up so quickly?
Sure. So I think for the Druze in Syria, there's a desire for them to be kind of an autonomous or semi-autonomous region, and they very much oppose Syrian troops in southwest of the country. And I think that's why it was just as much of a trigger for them as it was for Israel. What's interesting, though, is that while in Israel there seems to be an assumption that the Druze community in Syria wants them to get involved and come to their rescue, it's actually a little bit more complex than that. And there is a split amongst Syrian Druze about whether or not they want Israel to come and intervene. I think some of their leadership is more hardline and is for that, and others are actually willing to try to compromise and reach an agreement with Ahmed al-Shara's government and try to actually work within the lines of what the government is looking for. So that's the Druze right there. And I think I would say a changing dynamic, because I think they are still trying to decide for themselves which line they are, and they're not exactly as unified as one might expect. On the other hand, you also have the Syrian government, which I think definitely wants all these different ethnic groups, be it the Alawites, the Bedouin, the Druze, they want them to fall in line. And therefore, I think they are trying to take a bit of a harder line on the Druze who want to be more autonomous, and trying to get them to maybe bring their weapons to within the Syrian regime's military, as opposed to being kind of their own militia groups. At the same time, you have the president, al-Sharaa, who seems to be trying to distance himself from the attacks that took place against the Druze. There's clearly a lot of footage showing it wasn't just the Bedouin, but it was also Syrian military. So I think he's put out statements talking about that there will be consequences for those who carry out these attacks, but that's actually the same rhetoric that he used when there were attacks on Alawites several weeks ago, but nobody really ended up facing any consequences. And I think it just demonstrates a little bit about how he doesn't have a lot of control or full control over the military and various aspects of this government. It's still a very fledgling regime. And I think if you recall, some of these are jihadist forces that were at one point fighting in a very different construct that are now expected to act in a more, I think, statesmanly way, you could say, for lack of better words. That's the Syrian government. Then you have Israel, which I think its position is also shifting. I think it still wants this demilitarized southern west Syria. I think the feeling is that either Sharaa was behind these attacks on the Druze, and therefore his true colors are being shown, or they feel that he's too weak and unable to prevent what happened. And therefore, I think no matter which of those options it is, it implored Israel to act. It seems though Israel wants this autonomous region for Druze. That seems to be the preference, even though at the same time they do seem to be giving the chance to the Shara regime. If you recall, just 2 days ago, Gideon Sa'ar, the foreign minister, welcomed his Syrian counterpart, or welcomed the presence of his Syrian counterpart at this EU conference in Brussels. So they're still trying to flirt with this regime and see if there's an opportunity for Abraham Accords, even though they still like the idea of keeping a strong autonomous Druze section in the country. But at the same time, they're trying to grapple with the pressure they're feeling from Druze within the country, Israeli Druze, who are demanding that they intervene and defend their brethren. And I think these Druze civilians in Israel feel like the government owes them this, given that their loyalty to the state and their overwhelming participation in the IDF, and many of them have even lost family members serving in this war and other ones. That's, I would say, where Israel is. And then lastly, you have the US, which I think is a bit more similar to the Syrian regime. I think they very much want this government to succeed, and it put a lot on the line to just to see to that happening. That you saw the lifting of sanctions against Syria that decision that Trump made, and also Trump's decision to even meet with Shara a couple months ago and really hyping him up afterwards. I think that's the path they still want to try to move on. They definitely are, I think, recognizing that Shara needs to also put his money where his mouth is regarding the treatment of minorities, be it Druze or Alawites or anyone else in the country. That I think there's been attacks on Christians as well, that he needs to not only talk the game, but also act and ensure that they're protected, but are still willing to give him, I think, a little bit more space to do so than what Israel is doing. So it was interesting speaking to a U.S. official earlier on Wednesday that they recognize that the situation is very tense between Israel and Syria, and that we had this very quick deterioration. There is an interesting amount of optimism that he just expressed, that he felt that actually this incident may move the parties eventually closer to some sort of non-aggression act, because it only just emphasized the need for maybe not a full-blown normalization deal, which will take time, but at least some sort of security arrangement and understanding between the two sides to prevent these kinds of incidents from happening in the future, and that this incident may actually spur those negotiations in the coming weeks that will actually lead to more cooperation between Israel and Syria as opposed to less.
And bottom line, it certainly seems like it was the US that brokered or brought this to a quick close in the last less than 24 hours, right?
Yeah, I think the combination of the US really wanting this to not expand further, because if Israel continued striking maybe more sites in Damascus, we could have seen a really deterioration of the regime, and possibly another plunging into the sectarian violence that has really characterized Syria for so long. And you also had, in addition to the US not wanting this to get worse, I think you also had Syria, which recognized that it's the much weaker partner, the much weaker player in this dynamic. They weren't able to respond. You would think if a government had its defense or its military headquarters totally blown up by another country, there would be some sort of response, but there wasn't anything. And it shows like the difference in the breakdown in powers of this, the dynamic here, where Israel's in the much stronger hand. And yes, I think Israel also is stretched very thin at this point, and the notion of, hey, maybe getting involved even further in another front might be a little bit difficult, given how many, many hundreds of days that the reservists have been already serving, to force more and more to go into the Syria front would really test Israel's ability to continue fighting on other ones. And I think that would have likely played a factor at some point, but definitely I think on the Syrian and US side, there was a desire to end this as quickly as possible.
Okay. All right. Let's take a quick break, and when we're back, let's talk a little bit about Shas and what it actually means, its resignation from ministerial positions. So stay with us. Okay, so that's basically the issue that we have here with Shas. They've resigned from their ministerial positions, but have not quit the coalition, have not quit Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition. So that leaves the coalition intact. United Torah Judaism, another ultra-Orthodox party, did resign. What do we think we're seeing right now in terms of the coalition, and really, what does it mean in terms of Shas?
I think for now, the coalition is somewhat stable. The fact that, as you mentioned, they haven't left we're talking, therefore, at about a 60-seat coalition, where I think it was at 67 before UTJ, and then it took its 7 seats. You also have one seat in Avi Maoz, who's running the Noam party, that anti-LGBT party. He has also left the government or the coalition, but has said that he's willing to return if his demands are met. He's got various demands regarding education. Not so important right now, but bottom line, at 60 or 61, basically any vote moving forward really exposes the government to being kind of blackmailed by any one lawmaker who wants to make sure that he or she gets their agenda advanced. And I think it will make legislation very difficult once the Knesset returns to session at the end of October, early November. But until then, we're talking about a 3-month period starting on July 27th, where the Knesset goes into recess, where it will be very, very difficult for the government to fall. There's a very technical, various legal ways that the opposition can do it, but it's much more difficult, not least because there was already tried to pass legislation to bring down the government and it didn't succeed. So they have a 6-month waiting period basically before they can try to collapse the government through that mechanism.
And then they were in that 6-month period, right?
Right. So now Shas, the argument it was kind of similar to what UTJ said. They feel that Yuli Edelstein from Likud walked back understandings that were reached regarding the draft evasion law that they're trying to pass. That the coalition is very unpopular, I would say, legislation. And they've left their government ministry positions, but the question will be also whether their advisors leave those positions as well, because what we saw in the case of UTJ was that they've kept some of their main advisors in some of these ministries, so they're still able to effectively control them. And I think that will be something to watch in the coming days. Because these ultra-Orthodox parties very much want to be able to control, I think specifically in the case of Shas, the interior ministry, there's a lot of government funding that can go to different municipalities that if you totally leave those government ministries, that means less funds theoretically for the ultra-Orthodox. But I think what we're setting ourselves up for is clearly an early election at some point. I think there'll be an effort to try to get some compromise with Shas, even from the outside the government during the break period, this recess, to try to find some sort of agreement on the draft evasion law. I don't think it's very likely for that to succeed. But regardless, and part of the reason why is because regardless, we're talking about an election sometime in 2026. And whether it's in March or maybe later towards the summer, I think there's not a huge difference. I think it'll depend on when really Netanyahu feels most comfortable about heading towards elections in the next year. I think what is clear, though, is that he and probably the Haredi parties as well do not want the reason that they're going to elections to have to do with the draft evasion law, because it's something that's incredibly not popular amongst the rest of the electorate. And you'll see, I think, if it is the issue, you'll see all these opposition parties pouncing on that issue and being able to campaign against Netanyahu and the Haredi parties if they do it, as opposed to if it's actually the hostage deal. And that actually ends up being the reason that the government collapses, that it's over Smotrich and Ben Gvir's opposition to the deal that seems to be coming together. And I think that will be something that will be easier for the various parties to run on. So we'll have to see, I think, in the coming months, where those negotiations on the draft evasion law head.
Okay. And then sticking with the hostage deal, let's end with that. There seems to be sort of positive comments that are being made about it, that it is plausible, that it is possible, that it is attainable. What are you hearing from contacts about the negotiations that are ongoing in Doha?
Yeah. So what we saw, I think, around Wednesday, there was a briefing that a senior Israeli official held with reporters in Jerusalem that gave a lot of optimism about the chances for a deal, saying it's more likely than not, but also recognizing that there's still a little ways to go. While that was happening, I was speaking with a couple of diplomats who are out in Doha and involved in these negotiations, and they said that there's really been a major breakthrough that took place over the recent hours before we spoke, in that Israel had agreed to roll back a lot of its demands over the main obstacle that has been preventing, I guess, a deal until now, which is the issue of Israel's withdrawal and the scope of how much it withdraws its troops during this 60-day truce that's under discussion. Now, what Israel's agreed to do is basically accept Hamas's demand to return to what's called the March 2nd lines, which is where the IDF was located before the previous ceasefire started to collapse in early March. That's what Hamas has been demanding. What Israel has agreed to basically is that they still want what is about a 1 kilometer perimeter around the Gaza Strip, but before they were talking about a 2 or 3 kilometer perimeter, and then been talking about a 2 or 3 kilometer perimeter, even larger than that, buffer zone in Rafah, where it wanted to create this very controversial humanitarian city, where it would vet Palestinians upon entry, prevent them from leaving, and then try to encourage their migration elsewhere. That seems to be, if you go based off of what Israel's put forward now, kind of off the table, because the new buffer zone in Rafah is a lot smaller. Could Israel then eventually go back into Rafah and take over the territory much in a larger scope and then move forward the humanitarian city? Possibly. But for now, it'll be harder to do that with what it has agreed to do in these new maps that it has submitted to the mediators, and basically a much smaller area of Rafah that they're talking about. So with that issue, now seemingly it's not resolved yet. Hamas is now reviewing the Israeli maps. I think that's going to take another day or so until they respond. But given that this was the most difficult issue and this major shift on Israel's part, there's a lot more optimism, because on the one hand, you had this issue that Israel wasn't budging on for 2 weeks. And on the other hand, you had the issue of the commitments that Hamas was demanding for a permanent ceasefire, that it had basically caved on and agreed that it wasn't going to get an upfront Israeli commitment, but was going to trust a personal commitment from President Trump that he will make sure the negotiations and the truce remain until there's a deal reached on a permanent ceasefire, meaning it can go past 60 days if need be. So with both sides caving on those two issues, the mediators seem to be a lot more optimistic about the chances for a deal. We still have to deal with the issues of aid. There's a few things that need to be finalized, and then also negotiations on who will be released, how many people will be released. We're talking about the Palestinian prisoners in exchange for Israeli hostages. Those two things have to still be ironed out. But if you listen to mediators, they say that those are not the biggest issues that had to be overcome, and that we could really get a deal within days. There's still the basic assumption that, at least amongst the Arab mediators, that Netanyahu is trying to drag this out until the coalition or the Knesset enters recess on July 27th. So maybe it'll take another 9 or 10 days to get there, but we're still in a place where, at least from as far as they're concerned, the hardest issues have now been dealt with.
Okay, let's see what happens with it. Jacob, thank you very much for all the updates and the insights. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Jessica.
Sure, and thanks to you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing, and stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. You can always recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care and be well.